Roman numeral 6. And now we talk about women and their roles in American history and civil rights and so forth. Starting in the early days of the American colonies, you have to understand that women were basically considered to be property. Not property in the same sense that African Americans were, in that they were not literally slaves and they could not literally be bought and sold, but otherwise that was what a woman was. A man owned a wife. A man did not have a wife in terms of a partnership or anything like that. And so as a result, how much freedom and how much power a woman had depended largely upon what region of the country she lived in. In New England, for example, women were largely, again, a dime a dozen. There were, the gender balance was there. And so as a result, women were not given much in the way of rights. They were not given much in the way of authority. Women did have jobs, but the jobs they were allowed to do were stereotypically female jobs. For example, teacher was largely considered to be a female-only job, not a male job. Housekeeper, maid, those were all considered to be female jobs, child rearing. A step outside of those roles would have been a huge insult and a huge no for a woman to do. And so as a result, you very rarely saw it happen. Weirdly, the South is the area where you would probably see women have the most power. This is because the gender imbalance was not there. There were a lot more men than women in the American South, especially prior to the Revolution. And so as a result, a woman had a lot more power simply because she could afford to be choosy. Whereas up north, a woman needed to get married in order to have power of any sort. In the South, a woman still needed to get married, but now she could at least choose her partner. Whereas in the North, if a guy came along and he was fat and ugly and wanted to marry you, you might as well jump on it, because once you reach the age of 30, you are an old maid and no one will like you. In the South, however, if the fat and ugly man comes up to you, you can say no, because there are lots of other men who are competing for your attention and so forth. As a result, women in the South were largely viewed on a pedestal. They were put up on a pedestal, something to compete for. This creates the concept, though, of the double standard. The double standard that was applied to women during this period of time is the idea that women are both an object of idolization and perfection, and yet were not actually given any power. So in other words, they are put in such a position as to be viewed as valuable objects to be fought over and so forth, and yet have no actual functional power. It's sort of like a porcelain doll. They are beautiful, they are untouchable, and you put them in a glass case and never ever do anything else with them. They are a prize to be won. That's the idea of the double standard, that women were both simultaneously placed on a pedestal and almost always given very little power as well. Again, men were literally fighting duels over women. This was something you would still see in the South and to a certain extent in the North as well. If you wanted a woman's hand in marriage or just a woman's hand in general to date and be friends, two men could oftentimes, go to war with each other. They would, literally go out in the battlefield and shoot each other, 10 paces turned in fire kind of thing. And yet, once you got married, a woman's job was to stay in the house and shut up, make the pies, tend to the kids, produce as many children as humanly possible, and that was it. Which brings me to the other part of the double standard, is that the other reason why women had more power in the South is because a woman was also largely considered to be the head of the household slaves. And so as a result, that's where women could actually have a modicum of power, was by controlling the slaves. Which again, not exactly, something you'd want to brag about in this day and age, but that was true. It was, where women actually had some power. Women were also expected in the early days to produce as many children as humanly possible, because healthcare was, of course, abominable back in those days. So if a woman produced 12 children, maybe 2 would live to see adulthood. And so as a result, once you got married, you are going to be producing children pretty much at a constant pace, which is not a great thing or not exactly a comfortable thing. But again, that's the way things were. The birth of the women's rights movement, which is letter B on your outline, the birth of the women's rights movement dovetails with the anti-slavery movement, with the abolitionist movement. What happened was that women wanted to be in the abolitionist movement to work. Many women wanted to help towards, the abolition of slavery, getting rid of the slaves and so forth, but men didn't want them. The kicker was, in the early 1800s, I want to say 1844, someone can look this up if they really want to know the exact date, otherwise early 1800s will suffice, there was a World Anti-Slavery Conference in London, England, which people all over the world came together to talk about, well, anti-slavery, hence the name. Because if they wanted to talk about strawberry jam, calling it the World Anti-Slavery Conference would just be confusing. But in any case, the World Anti-Slavery Conference in London, people came to this meeting, and among them, two women, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. These are people we should know. Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They had come to the World Anti-Slavery Conference in order to talk about anti-slavery. When they got there, they were denied entry because they were women. And they were told women had no point and no purpose and they could leave now. And so Mott and Stanton basically argued, what's the point in arguing for anti-slavery when we're basically being treated like slaves ourselves? So they went back home and started the first ever convention for women's rights, the Seneca Falls Convention. Seneca Falls Convention is the first convention in the name of women's rights. It takes place at Seneca Falls, New York. Again, 1840s, I want to say, early to mid-1800s would suffice. But again, it's the first conference in the name of women's rights. They passed the Declaration of the Rights of Women, which was a play off the Declaration of the Rights of Men, which is the French Revolution. In it, they argued for things like gender equality in the workplace and the woman's right to vote. For the most part, women were laughed off. It's sort of like the early stages of the anti-slavery movement. There was very much an argument over whether or not women should protest publicly and violently, whether they should just be quiet and just accept what they have. But for the most part, women did not get a lot of early traction. Most of the gains they had were very small and very regional. And again, victories nevertheless, but very, very small. Most of the stuff they pushed were things like social issues, things like temperance or prohibition. A lot of that was driven by women and so forth. For example, Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation was, and again, another name you might want to know because this is kind of awesome. Carrie Nation was an early women's rights advocate as well, but she was also an advocate for prohibition. She stood in the doorways of saloons swinging an axe. That's right, she had a gigantic axe, and she just stood in the doorway of bars, and she would swing them at people trying to go and get alcohol. Carrie Nation also argued again for women's rights, but basically arguing, no one else is going to do this, I'm going to do it. So Carrie Nation was viewed as one of these, again, people arguing for women's rights. One of the more famous women arguing for women's rights that you're probably more familiar with, Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony is a very big person in the field of women's rights. You're probably more familiar with her. I'm trying to think of where you might know her from. She was on the dollar coin in the 1970s. But Susan B. Anthony basically took the same nonviolent approach that Martin Luther King Jr. would take. What she would do is she mainly argued for the right to vote. She would march in, try to vote, be arrested, pay the fine, come back, and try to vote again. She would constantly do this. Try to vote, get arrested, try to vote, get arrested. That she gathered more and more supporters. Those supporters of Susan B. Anthony who also tried to vote were known as the suffragettes, because the right to vote is called suffrage. So suffragettes were women who were arguing for the right to vote. Again, suffragettes, women trying to vote, followers of Susan B. Anthony, and so forth. The suffragettes worked really, really hard in the late 1800s to try to get women the right to vote, with mixed results. They had better results overseas. England, for example, I believe was the first country to give women the right to vote. And again, other countries, as they got their constitutions, France and so forth, gave women the right to vote by the time you get to the late 1800s, early 1900s. In the US, women don't get the right to vote until World War I. Basically what happened is, in World War I, the men went off to fight in the war. Women were not allowed in the army and so forth. And this was a very big concern among the U.S. because the fear was if all the men go off to fight in the war, the women will be the ones left behind. And the women will be running the country. And oh my gosh, what could possibly happen? What if they start getting all emotional and having, problems? What if they cry on the Constitution? Oh my goodness, what will we do? And again, I'm really not exaggerating that much. This was a genuine concern during the period with that if women were running the country, things would fall apart in our absence and then our enemies would just take over. So women, of course, did run the country and didn't destroy it. And we came back and we were all very surprised. We're like, oh, wow, that's good. And so as a result, you get the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment was basically viewed as like the reward the women get for not screwing up the country while all the men were away. The 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. 19th Amendment, again, gives women the right to vote. 19th Amendment gives women right to vote. This is, again, viewed as almost a reward for not messing up the country while the men were all off fighting in the war. So again, wow, that's really sexist, but hey, that was our logic. World War II, women took a more active role in, though. They still were not in the army. They were not allowed to fight, but they were helpful on the front of the production front, if you will. This is where you get Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter was an icon based around the idea of working women in World War II. She was based off of a real person, but when we talk about Rosie the Riveter, what we're talking about is the icon, the symbol. You probably know what I'm talking about. If you don't, it's the woman in the bandana and the denim going, "We can do it!" That's Rosie the Riveter. She was an advertising slogan, really, or an advertising figure, but the term stuck and became a sign almost of pride for women. The idea that working women in World War II were viewed as Rosies. That's what they were called. And they were used in heavy labor, something that was unconscionable before World War II. They were working on building ships. They were building heavy artillery. They were, again, getting dirty and grimy. And oh my gosh, can women even do that? Won't they break their nails? And this was a huge, But again, desperate times call for desperate measures. For women, they got to go to the workplace and work in factories. For Asian Americans, they got shoved into camps. It was a weird time for everybody. So women, at the result of World War II, again, get their sense of, rights and pride as being Rosies and so forth. But when they come back, things get to be more problematic. You basically have the idea of the woman question after the war. The woman question was basically, well, what do we do now? Because all the men came back and basically said, all right, go back home, start baking pies and producing children again. And women didn't want to do that. Women were very happy with what they had accomplished during World War II and frankly liked working and wanted to stay there. So how do you put the genie back in the bottle? This was very much sort of the woman question again, is what do we do exactly here with all these women that want to work? But there's another side of it too. The other side of the question was for women themselves, which is what do they want? For a lot of women, they felt unfulfilled being wives and mothers and so forth. But on the other hand, there also was a question of, do we really want women in the workplace and so forth? Or, can they handle all jobs? Would a woman want that? Some women are happy being wives and mothers. So again, the woman question is sort of twofold. One is, what do we do about the fact that women now like to be employed? And for women, what is it that they really want? This brings you to the feminine mystique, and for that matter, Betty Friedan. The Feminine Mystique was a book written by Betty Friedan in the 1960s. In The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan is basically arguing about the woman question. In The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan is basically talking about what she called the problem that has no name. It was originally just supposed to be an article, but it got expanded into being a book and so forth. In this book, the problem that has no name, she basically talks about, is this internal frustration that women have. The idea being that society expects women to only be wives and mothers, and yet many women want to be more than that. And this is the problem they have to face now, because again, the idea here is that women never had an opportunity before, but now, thanks to World War II, now they know there's an option. They know they can do it, and yet they're being forced by society to sit down, shut up, and just, again, produce children and pie. Which, again, she's talking about, the psychological toll that this takes on them. She talks about how women are not being fulfilled by being wives and mothers, by household work and so forth, and so this is not something that they want. The Feminine Mystique caused a huge outcry when it first came out. A lot of women said, yay, more power to you. A lot of women said, no, that's not what I'm feeling at all. A lot of men said, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is what we're doing to our wives and mothers. And a lot of men said, hey, get back in the kitchen and make pie and children. So the Feminine Mystique and Betty Friedan are oftentimes viewed as sort of the reason for this second wave of feminism. If the first wave was back in the 1800s and culminated with the 19th Amendment, this is the second wave of feminism in the 1960s and 70s, which again, not coincidentally, is also the same time that you're seeing the civil rights movement for African Americans. Betty Friedan would go on to be a major player in, among other things, Ms. Magazine. Ms. Magazine was a magazine all about women's rights, women's issues, and again, a women's magazine. The idea of a woman's magazine itself was not unusual. There were lots of women's magazines. But the thing of it was that most women's magazines were, how-to guides, like Better Homes and Gardens and Southern Living. Magazines which are all about, again, how to make the best pie and how to discipline your children. Ms. Magazine was unique in that it talked about women from other perspectives. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you doing? What are other women doing? Rather than just, again, here's how to maintain your household best. The title itself, Ms. Magazine, is also significant because during the 70s when you see the word Ms. first used. See, prior to this, there were only two titles used for women. There was Mrs., M-R-S, period, Mrs., which implies someone is married, or Miss, M-I-S-S, which implies someone is not married. Well, the feeling was, we're more than just whether we're married or not. So a woman's title doesn't necessarily need to be about whether or not she's married. And so as a result, you get Ms., M-S, period. M-S, Ms., basically means that you can't tell if she's married or not because it's irrelevant. And this became the preferred title for many women in the 70s and 80s. The idea being, again, that I'm more than just whether or not I have a husband, so don't call me by my married status. All of this sort of comes together with the attempt of the ERA. The ERA was would have been a constitutional amendment, spoilers, would have been a constitutional amendment in the 1970s that would have banned discrimination based on gender. Would have, again, sort of like how the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment banned discrimination based on race, the ERA would have banned discrimination based on gender. It didn't pass. It was 2 states short of getting into the Constitution. The reason why it didn't make it into the Constitution was largely due to things like the feminist counterpush. The feminist counterpush was a reaction to second-wave feminism in that it's sort of pushing against it, saying the similarity here is basically like we talked about black nationalism. Just as we said how black nationalism and black power said that African Americans shouldn't want integration, the feminist counterpush said that women shouldn't want equality with men. The logic being that women have their own benefits, if you will. For example, women are the only ones who can breed children. They are the only ones who can be mothers. And so as a result, we don't want women to give up what makes them feminine. We don't want women to join the military. We don't want women to, start smoking cigars and being like men. The feminist counterpush made the argument that the ERA would do things, again, like put women in the military, that would, get rid of maternity leave. It was part of the argument. And so the feminist counterpush, again, not led just by men. There were a lot of women in the feminist counterpush as well. The argument being that for a lot of women, I want to be a wife and mother, don't tell me I can't be. And they viewed feminism as an attempt to stop them from doing that. So the counterpush, again, as the name implies, pushed against the second wave of feminism and led to things like the defeat of the ERA and so forth. Under modern gender issues, this gets you to, again, modern gender issues, you've got phenomenon like the glass ceiling. The glass ceiling refers to an invisible barrier at work that women cannot rise above. Hence why it's glass, because you can't see glass you look through. So it's an invisible barrier above which women cannot reach. The argument of the glass ceiling is that women, whether it be by choice or just by habit or by latent sexism or whatever, are essentially blocked from achieving certain goals. If you look, for example, at like the Fortune 500 companies, it's something like, 5% are run by women? The argument being that women are not promoted, regardless of their skills. They are always going to be viewed as only wives and mothers, and therefore cannot progress past that level. So, again, in some cases, this is just simply out of habit. Again, we like to be around people that we're similar to, so men promote men because, hey, we like men. Well, in other places, it really was acknowledged. Like, there are documents where, they flat out say, hey, we're not ever going to promote a woman and so forth. So the glass ceiling has been something that women in the workplace have always had to fight against. Take, for example, what they talked about in the military. They just recently allowed women into the special forces. This was often referred to as the glass ceiling of the military, that women could only reach so far before they stopped getting promoted and stopped getting, let in and so forth. This also gets you to the idea of the mommy track. The mommy track refers to the idea that schools and society push young women and girls towards becoming mothers. not anything else. For example, in the 1950s, boys in school could take things like wood shop and metal shop, things where they could learn how to build stuff with their hands and, eat grease and spit nails and be manly. Whereas women were taught things like home ec. Home economics is how to balance a checkbook and how to bake a pie. And so the idea is that even if a girl was interested in chemistry and science, she was steered away from that onto the mommy track, where she would learn things, that she would be useful as a mommy. Think of it also like how sports were treated and so forth. The men were given, the rough and tumble contact sports, while the women in schools were always sort of steered towards the less contact sports and so forth. Again, I'm not saying cheerleading is not a sport, but again, look at 1950s cheerleading, where it really wasn't. 1950s cheerleading is literally, let's just stand and look cute. So again, all that's part of the mommy track. You can also see this again in larger society. Go and look at, for example, the toy aisles. What are all the boys' toys? It's the construction equipment. It's the army guns and stuff like that. What are the girls' toys? It's, the fashion dolls. It's the play kitchen and so forth. You can't get a blue, easy bake oven easily. It's all pink stuff. And again, because that's what the track you're putting girls on. You're saying your job is to become a wife and mother, not become, again, a scientist or whatever. And finally, the issue of sexual harassment. Sexual harassment, by definition, I believe, is basically it's like discrimination. You're picking on a woman based upon their gender and so forth. This can be verbal sexual harassment, making demeaning jokes and so forth, but it can also be physical sexual harassment, such as unwanted touching and so forth. Sexual harassment is illegal. However, it is still unfortunately quite common. Sexual harassment in the workplace, again, oftentimes takes the form of verbal sexual harassment. And the problem there is that verbal sexual harassment is much harder to prove. It's much harder to prove what somebody said or what they meant than it is physical sexual harassment, where there are oftentimes, again, markings and so forth. And so as a result, women oftentimes find that reporting sexual harassment gets very little accomplished. And of course, then it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. Because nothing happens, they don't want to report it. Because they don't want to report it, nothing happens, and so on and so forth. So sexual harassment becomes a very big issue that women have to deal with in the workplace. This also gets into the terminology that's referred to nowadays as rape culture and so forth. The idea being that women are naturally not believed when it comes to matters like sexual harassment and rape and so forth, that society's natural inclination is to blame the victim and so forth. Well, what were you dressing? What were you wearing? What did you say? What did you do? And so forth. Whereas other crimes, we don't automatically do that. We don't automatically look and say, if your house was broken into, we don't ask, well, did you put all your valuable stuff in a window? So again, sexual harassment and all of that sort of get bundled together. Now, you can make the counter argument that, again, just like with the feminist counter push, that you can argue that we go too far, that sometimes people are punished for innocuous jokes, that people are punished for things that are misinterpreted, that you have lots of false claims and so forth. So, again, it's one of those things where there's nothing clear-cut. Like all issues of discrimination, racism, civil rights, so forth, there's very little that's clear-cut. But those all fall into the modern issues that women have to face. In terms of politics, women tend to be more liberal, especially on social issues. Women tend to fall on the Democrat side, on the liberal side, especially when it comes to social issues. The catch being that when they get married, women tend to become more conservative because, remember, conservative people generally want to keep what they have, and married women generally have more, if you will, in terms of more to lose. They have a family, they have more money, they have more job stability, and so forth. So as a result, married women tend to be more conservative, whereas single women tend to be more liberal. Women, in terms of voting, are arguably less represented than you would think, because I think in terms of demographics, they're actually more than 50% of the population, and yet you look at Congress and so forth, they're clearly not 50% of Congress. So while women could be a bigger voting bloc, they are generally not, again, as powerful as you might think. So, all right, the last thing we're going to get into other groups, which is Roman numeral, 7? We're talking about homosexuality, we're talking about age, we're talking about disability, citizenship, and so on and so forth. So, one more Roman numeral to go. Whee!